Good evening from Peter and Yuan.
Hi, everyone.
We're here with office hours for ChinaX number 18. And Yuan, you're in Taipei,
Yes.
Taiwan, right?
Yes. This is my.
What are you doing there?
This is my apartment in Taipei. I'm currently a visiting scholar in Academia Sinica, 中央研究院 in Chinese, Institute for Modern History.
Are you enjoying yourself? Do you like Taiwan?
I've been here, I think, about 3 months, and I've fallen in love with the city. I love here, and I love the cultural environment, the natural landscape of the city, and it's a wonderful place. I recommend everyone to visit here if you have time.
Great. Good.
Yeah, and actually very interesting that I'm working on a chapter now focusing on how the people in Qing Dynasty, 18th century, 17th century, disagreed with Neo-Confucians and marginalized their culture.
Oh, and that's our subject for this week, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
Well, I'm here in Hong Kong.
Yeah, what are you doing in Hong Kong?
I've been giving lectures called, a series of 3 lectures called the Qianmu Lectures. Qianmu was one of the greatest historians of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And he founded New Asia College here at the Chinese University of Hong Kong.
Mm-hmm.
These lectures were created in his honor. You know, I'm going to get the 27th annual lecture this year. And he was an historian who also was interested in intellectual history. And he was very interested in Neo-Confucianism.
Yes.
So again, that's an appropriate subject. You know, we gave people a lot of readings this past week.
Yes.
And particularly on the week before with Su Shi, Wan Shi, and Sima Guang.
Mm-hmm.
We've heard from some of you that those readings took an enormous amount of time. We appreciate you spending the time. And you know, you should feel that if you have to, you can cut some things out or you can go back to them later.
Yes.
I think one of the challenges is always reading things in translation from a foreign place from a long time ago and trying to figure out how they express themselves when you're not used to it. And both you and I are sort of used to it, and so we don't see how difficult it is anymore.
It is still difficult.
Right. Now, you know, we had this other challenge for you. Oh, I should.
By the way,
I'm going back to Harvard this coming Sunday, April 13th, and on April 14th at 6:30 p.m. Cambridge time, we're going to be having a sort of open discussion with ChinaX people in Boston, Alston, name of the place, but also around the world because it'll be live streamed. And it's going to be about the Yin Ying story, that famous love story. We'll be sending you a message about that to let you know how you can get in and listen in and take part in that discussion.
And you mentioned that there were also ChinaX students.
Yes. So I gave a public lecture this past Sunday here in Hong Kong, and I asked the audience, how many of you know about ChinaX? And a whole bunch of hands went up of people who are ChinaX students. That was a real pleasure, and they came up afterwards and we had a wonderful chat. Even went out to lunch with one. So we had these 3 paintings from the Sima Guang Wan Shi Su Shi week, and we asked you to tell us which painting you associate with whom. And now Yuan objected to this. She thought it was very, very subjective, and it was.
It's interesting.
But tell me, which painting would you associate with Wang Anshi?
So first, the question asks us to think for a moment like an art historian. So there are many different ways for art historians to make connections between ideas and visual images and artistic styles. I think for us, so I think for the 2 paintings out of the 3, the answers are fairly apparent. For instance, for the painting of early spring, And we heard from the lecture that it was actually a propaganda painting to promote the Wang Anshi's new form, 新法. And I think there's a reason for that.
But do you think that fits?
Yeah, of course. I think there's a reason for that. The kind of historical connections also justify the kind of shared ideas between the vision that the painting trying to show and the vision of Wang Anshi. And
so what's the connection?
I think if you look at the painting carefully, you see something that perhaps you don't see in reality. It's not really realistic in the sense that you see some mechanism or some you can feel that there is a kind of dynamic feeling that underlying the images that you see. You see the interactions of many different parts of the painting, and you see there is a kind of qi that is moving. So I think from the painting we see that it is a dynamic system full of interactions and transformations in underlying the natural landscape that you are seeing. And it seems promise.
It seemed to me that Fan Quan's painting, right, is all about stability. Right? This big central mountain, right? Everything is regular. Things tend to be more or less symmetrical. It's very strong on hierarchy. You don't get this dynamic sense of the world about to change.
Yeah, the kind of qi moving around. Yeah.
What was interesting, I don't know, I forget now whether I mentioned this in the lecture, but I had a student once who said, when he looked at the Guoxi painting, early spring, it made him feel uneasy. And he looked at the Fan Quan painting, and he felt much more secure. He's a very conservative student, and then Wen Tong, besides the fact that he's Su Shi's cousin, and Su Shi writes about Wen Tong's bamboo paintings, right? That whole notion of having it in the breast and then sort of the creative act of painting out the bamboo. I think that there's why is that more Su Shi than not? In part because he talks about bamboo, but also because the bamboo is pliable. Bamboo bends with the wind, but it doesn't break. It comes back to its original position. And Su Shi, it seems to me, very often is saying that he'll respond to events. He'll go one way, then he'll go the other, but in the end, he comes back and he has his own position. Well, in any case.
So you think there's a kind of link that based on a kind of symbolism of bamboo as a kind of
I think there's sort of a link in the very nature of bamboo, perhaps, that's being painted there, and being able to, but also being able to capture the living thing through painting. That art and literature can capture something that's very alive.
Yeah, and for me, I think it also shows a kind of emphasis on the literary or artistic creation, which has a power to transform the artist or the writer and to see things deeply or to capture something that you don't see if you don't pursue the kind of literary or artistic activity.
Yeah, I think that's very good. Yeah, I agree with that very much.
Yeah.
By the way, somebody wrote in a question for us, and they said, well, what's the Chinese term for Neo-Confucianism? And they said, well, they look up Songming Li Xue, the learning of principle or the learning of coherence of the Song and Ming dynasties, which is the modern sort of term. But the other term, Dao Xue, learning of the way, says, but isn't that Taoist? And the answer is no, it's not. That actually, Taoism is almost never called Dao Xue, learning of the way. It would be called Dao Zhao, the teaching of the way.
The teaching of the Dao, Yeah,
the teaching of the Dao. And Dao Xue is, in fact, the term that's being used at first by the Neo-Confucians themselves. And what sets their kind of learning apart is that it's focused on the way, the moral way, rather than, for example, on literature and art, rather than on culture.
Even though both, yeah. So even though both the literary figure like Su Shi and political figure like Wang Anshi, they all talk about Dao, but they didn't use the Dao as a title to define our learning.
Right. Now we had a sort of a short response here, and the question was, why is it important that Neo-Confucianism based the interpretation on the classics on principles evident in nature?
Yes.
Now, I'm not entirely happy with that formulation of principles evident in nature, but if we could just take it, why do Neo-Confucians base their ideas about morality on principles that are in nature itself? And we've chosen 4 really interesting responses.
Yeah.
And the first was from Colin Smith.
I think his answer is very interesting. He says that by basing their interpretations on principles evident in nature, and the Neo-Confucians provided a common, universal foundation for their beliefs. And I think it's very interesting because the answer focused on what makes the belief of Neo-Confucianism theoretically meaningful and shareable with different people. And so because nature is something that people could approach, different people can approach, and therefore make the theory possible for people to share as a common source of value. And
there's
go
a guy
ahead.
named Lee Sanders, who makes the point that nature is something that's always present, right? And possible as a guide. Nature provides, or at least the Neo-Confucian conception of nature, is that nature is potentially a perfect system.
Yes.
Right? And that's a coherent system, and that's part of the attraction.
Yes.
Let's see. Who else did you pick somebody else out?
Yes. It's another answer from a slightly different angle. It's very interesting. From a ChinaXer whose account name is Mouse SZ. So he or she writes, because it validates their interpretations. Anyone can read a classic and come up with its own idea and its own understanding, and it can be difficult to say whose interpretation is the right one. So he or she thinks that Neo-Confucians, by relying on the nature, try to show evidence of their own interpretation and give authority to them. So I think this is also very interesting because it's from a social cultural angle, I would say. So the answer gave us an explanation on why Neo-Confucianism turned into a very successful ideology in history, I think. Because it gives them a certain kind of authority to justify such a belief system. And I think this answer also gives us a direction even to understand why Neo-Confucianism eventually fell in the 17th century, by thinking about why and how their interpretation of classical learning lost their validity. So I learned something.
I think you're jumping ahead.
Yeah.
I think you're jumping ahead. My last choice is Al Reiser, who actually brings up the issue of Neo-Confucianism versus Buddhism, and makes the point that Neo-Confucians want to insist the world is real. It's not an illusion. And that notion of a real world that's really out there, that's not illusory, that nature is something you can always sort of knock on the head, you can point to. It's a way of talking about things being real, and thus that the foundation for morality has to be real as well. Now, we also had this big discussion forum on the question of, is Neo-Confucianism philosophy or a religion? It's
a very tricky question. So first I want to say that the answers we picked out all have their own definitions about what counts as philosophy, what counts as religion. I think the students all realize that depending on how you define these two categories, you may come up with different conclusions. So the first student, so ChinaXer, Bai Feng, so he thinks Neo-Confucianism is a kind of philosophy, and it is a kind of rational and a secular philosophy that was developed and formulated in reaction to religion, and it focused on incremental and rational process of self-improvement, and he thinks this made Neo-Confucianism look more like a philosophy. The rationality and the element of the kind of intellectualism there. But he also says that he noticed some mystical elements in the theory as well, and in various parts, such as the system described in Zhou Dunyi's 太极图说, supreme polarity.
Right.
Yeah, he thinks that made Neo-Confucianism also look like a religion. But I think perhaps a more helpful way is to say that kind of mystical element in Zhou Dunyi is more metaphysical rather than religious for me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, Dave Pomerantz, who's we've heard from before, and it's done a lot of work on ChinaX, says, well, it's a philosophy with religious elements in practice. And he proposes a definition of religion versus philosophy in order to make his case that it's a philosophy. It strikes me that one of the questions that comes up here with religion is whether the universe has a purpose. And it seems, I'm not sure, with the Neo-Confucian point of view, that there's the notion that heaven and earth, the universe, right, have no mind. They just are as they are. I think what that means is they have no bias. But does it have a purpose? Does it have a purpose? I'm still wondering about that. It seemed to me that the Neo-Confucians are saying, well, it does have a purpose. It has as its purpose its own existence. But it's not purposeless. That gives me a lot to think about. Now,
yeah, there's, for instance, take Zhou Dunyi's system as example, that it looks like a perfect system and it exists there and it has a sophisticated system. But I don't think, so I will not call that system religious or that kind of view of universe religious. And also for the lack of a anthropomorphic gods or humanized depictions of the metaphysical world as the source to define the moral codes. So, but I think what is more interesting is to think about why Neo-Confucianism needs such a metaphysical and perfect natural system to describe the world in order to operate their moral learning. So the next answer that we've chosen is from Corgan 45, and he or she begins with interesting definitions. So Corgan 45 defines philosophy as an intellectual exercise that develops a worldview from argument and can be modified by further argument. So it can be modified and can be wrong now. So as long as there are a justified argument, then there might be even a better explanation of the worldview in the future. But religion is an exercise that develops a worldview from an impeachable source, and so it cannot be modified in a way that transcends the original tenets. So because of the unimpeachable source. So this is the difference that this ChinaXer sees. And he or she continues saying that Neo-Confucianism should be seen as a hybrid of these two kind of things. The religion aspects includes that there is a right and a wrong thing that exists called Li in the world. And the philosophy aspects includes trying to build a world view and a path for behavior through logical argument and to some extent observations.
But it seems to me that one of the things about Neo-Confucianism is that it doesn't lend itself to self-correction. That once the doctrine and ideas are in place, as I remember, looking at somebody in the 14th century says, well, we already know what we're supposed to do. Now we should stop talking about philosophy and just enact it, just do it.
Yeah.
And there's not that sense that there's a process of inquiry involved that will lead to improvement in understanding. It's the individual has to make greater effort.
Yes, so I actually haven't finished the last part, that this comment, because Cordon 45 then mentioned some cultural and social aspects of the movement. He or she thinks that then when the movement entered the realm of ritual and worship, and it gives New Confucianism a very strong color of religion.
That's makes the argument that religion sees the world as purposeful, not random. And that philosophy tries to explain good and evil. And it seems to me that Neo-Confucians then, if I take that standard, are both religious and philosophical. Right? The world is purposeful, it's not random, and yet they want to explain good and evil. It strikes me that the Neo-Confucian explanation for evil is, in fact, a way of saying that it's caught up with the notion of selfishness. That to see in terms of your own self-interest, rather than seeing the interest of the larger whole, is what leads to evil in the world. You see what I mean? That that's what's destructive of the social order, what's destructive of the larger organism of life itself, is behavior that is self-interested, that in order to pursue your own ends leads to the destruction or harm to others. And that notion of selfish desire, and an attempt to deny it, I think, is part of Neo-Confucianism. On one hand, they accept emotions, and love and strong emotions are acceptable, and yet they want to argue that selfishness is really different. And I think later on people will say, well, it's hard to make that distinction between desire and emotionality and feeling. At least in my life, it's not always clear to me what the line is between the two.
So basically, New Confucians, and even to a larger degree, all the other literati scholars, when they talk about selfishness or the meaning of goodness, they don't seem to disagree with each other. So they don't care too much about how to define what being good really means.
Yeah, that is true.
Yeah, so then if this is true, then I think the 18th answer is very interesting here, because his answer begins from the perspective, begins from a re-examination of the analytical concepts of philosophy or religion that we used here. He says, if Chinese accept the Western etymology of philosophy, love of knowledge, and if moral philosophy is therefore love of moral knowledge, then Neo-Confucianism can claim itself as a moral philosophy. In this way, then we have parallel system of thought between the West and the Chinese. If we define Neo-Confucianism as a moral philosophy, but on the other hand, he noticed that, but in the West, you have many different competing voices about what the notion of goodness and morality really means. So a lot of philosophers really care about finding the answer or having argument over what is a definite definition for goodness. But he or she finds that in Neo-Confucianism, they seems to already agree with each other that what morality means, and then what they are arguing about is about what path will lead to that.
I see the point. I'm not sure how much they agree with each other all the time. I think some people are more situational. They see that what it means to say what's good depends more on the situation, and some people want it to be a bit more absolute. Wang Yangming is interesting about this. He says at one point, his disciple says to Wang Yangming, he says, well, I'm having trouble with the flowers and the weeds, right? Keeping the weeds out, by which he means sort of selfish thoughts and things like this. And Wang Yangming says, well, don't worry about it so much, right? Depending on the situation, some things are weeds, some things are flowers, but that's not going to be a constant situation. Other thing that Wang Yangming says that causes a lot of trouble for some people. He says, Wu Shan Wu Xin Zhi Banti, right? That the mind in itself has neither good nor evil. And that has lots of implications, if you say that. Right? But I think we should probably stop there and say goodnight to everybody here from East Asia, where it's already late at night, and wish everybody a good week. And Yuan, I want to thank you very much for taking time to join us.
It's my honor.
Break from your studies. Okay, good night, everyone.
Bye.